If you marry that girl, you are no longer my son." Margaret Beaumont stood in the marble foyer of her $15 million Manhattan estate. Her diamond necklace caught the chandelier light as she pointed toward the door. Her son Daniel, 28 years old, stood frozen, holding the hand of Sophie Martinez, a waitress he had met 6 months earlier. "Mom, please." "Don't." Margaret's voice was ice. "I raised you for Harvard, for boardrooms, for success, not to throw everything away on this." She didn't even look at Sophie. That was 10 years ago. Today, Margaret sits alone in a one-bedroom apartment, her hands trembling as she dials a number she swore never to call again. But let me tell you how a woman who had everything lost it all, and how the person she hurt most became her only salvation. March 2015. Margaret Beaumont was 58 and at her peak. She owned Beaumont Capital Management, one of New York's top wealth firms. Her circle included senators and CEOs. Margaret built this empire after her husband James died when Daniel was 12. Every decision Margaret made was calculated. Every relationship served a purpose. Everything was under control. Except her son. Daniel had always been different. He volunteered at soup kitchens instead of country clubs. He studied social work before Margaret convinced him to get his MBA. For years, Margaret planned his future. He would marry Charlotte Sterling, daughter of the Sterling banking dynasty. He would take over Beaumont Capital. He would maintain the legacy. Then, Daniel met Sophie. Sophie was 26, working as a waitress while attending nursing school at night. She lived in Queens with 2 roommates. Her parents were immigrants who owned a small grocery store. From Margaret's view, Sophie was everything wrong. Wrong background, wrong education, wrong class. From Daniel's view, Sophie was everything right. She was kind to elderly customers. She helped her siblings with homework. She never complained about double shifts. When Daniel announced he wanted to marry Sophie, Margaret realized this wasn't rebellion. This was betrayal. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. Daniel brought Sophie to her mother's office. Margaret sat behind her mahogany desk, Manhattan stretched behind her. "Mom, I want you to meet Sophie Martinez. We've been dating 6 months. I've asked her to marry me." Margaret's eyes swept over Sophie. Simple dress, worn shoes, hands showing calluses. "Daniel, leave us. I need to speak with you alone." "Mom, Sophie is part of this." "No, she is not." Sophie stood. "Mrs. Beaumont, I understand this is a shock. I know I'm not what you expected, but I love your son, and he loves me." "You want what?" Margaret's voice cut like glass. "To spend my son's money? Destroy his career? Embarrass this family?" Daniel's voice rose. "That's unfair." "Unfair? I raised you alone. I sacrificed everything for your education, your opportunities, and you want to throw it away for a girl from a diner? Her name is Sophie, and yes, I want to marry her." Silence. "If you marry this girl, you receive nothing. No money, no job, no family support. You're cut off completely." Daniel stood and took Sophie's hand. "Then that's my answer." They walked toward the door. "Daniel, if you leave, you're making a choice. Once made, there's no going back." Daniel turned one last time. "I understand perfectly, Mom, and that's the saddest thing about this conversation." The door closed. Margaret called her attorney. "Rebecca, I need something. Daniel has a trust fund activating at 30. Freeze it. Remove him from succession." "Margaret, are you sure?" "Absolutely. Daniel needs to learn choices have consequences. He'll come back when he realizes what he gave up." But Daniel didn't come back. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Sophie married at Brooklyn City Hall. 15 people attended. Margaret wasn't invited. Daniel got a social worker job, making $42,000 yearly. Sophie graduated nursing school and started at a community clinic. They moved to Queens. Margaret heard everything through her circle. Each detail felt like a knife. Her son living in Queens, making $42,000, married to a nurse. Every society event became torture. "How is Daniel? We heard about his career. His wife seems lovely." Margaret smiled and changed subjects. But inside, certainty cracked. Not about being right, she'd never admit wrong, but about when Daniel would realize his mistake. She waited for the call, the apology, the admission that love doesn't pay bills. The call never came. Instead, Margaret's world began crumbling in ways she never anticipated. For now, she sat surrounded by success, convinced she taught her son a lesson. She had no idea the lesson was just beginning, and that the teacher would become the student.
3 years after Daniel's wedding, Margaret Beaumont still believed she was right. But being right had started to feel lonely. Her 60th birthday party was everything money could buy. The Plaza Hotel ballroom, 200 guests in designer labels, a 7-tier cake costing more than most monthly rents, champagne older than some servers pouring it. Margaret stood in the center, smiling, accepting congratulations. But her eyes kept drifting to the entrance, waiting for someone who would never walk through. "Your son couldn't make it?" asked Patricia Chambers, wife of a hedge fund manager. "Daniel has his own life now," Margaret replied smoothly. "You know how young people are with their careers." What she didn't say was that she hadn't invited him. What she didn't say was that she had no idea if Daniel even knew it was her birthday. The party ended at midnight. Margaret returned to her penthouse alone. Her housekeeper had left everything perfect: fresh flowers, dim lighting, silence. Margaret poured herself a scotch and sat by the window, looking at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Daniel was living in Queens, working his modest job, coming home to Sophie in their small apartment. Were they happy? The question surprised Margaret. She pushed it away immediately. Of course they weren't happy. How could they be? Living paycheck to paycheck, no savings, no security, no future. Margaret had been protecting Daniel from that life. He just couldn't see it yet. But as months passed, the cracks in Margaret's certainty grew wider. It started small. A client mentioned seeing Daniel at a community center teaching financial literacy to low-income families. The man spoke with genuine admiration. "Your son is doing remarkable work, Mrs. Beaumont. He turned down my job offer, said he was exactly where he needed to be." Margaret smiled politely. Inside, something twisted. Daniel had turned down a 6-figure job? Then came the hospital incident. Margaret was visiting a colleague recovering from surgery at Mount Sinai. She saw Sophie in the hallway, wearing scrubs, talking gently to an elderly patient who seemed confused and frightened. Sophie held the woman's hand, took time explaining things twice, 3 times, made the woman laugh. The patient's daughter approached afterwards with tears, thanking Sophie for her kindness. Margaret watched from around the corner, unnoticed. This was the girl she had dismissed as a gold digger, A girl who could have been shopping on her son's trust fund was instead working overnight shifts at a public hospital. Something uncomfortable settled in Margaret's chest. She left quickly. The real blow came at a charity gala 6 months later. Margaret was receiving an award for her foundation's work, a foundation she had created primarily for tax benefits and social status. During cocktail hour, she overheard a conversation. "Did you hear about the Beaumont situation? That's so sad." "What situation?" another voice asked. "Her son Daniel, completely cut off from the family fortune because he married for love instead of money. Can you imagine?" "Well, I met his wife Sophie at the hospital when my mother was sick. Sweetest person you could meet. And Daniel volunteers at 3 different nonprofits. They're genuinely good people." Makes you wonder who made the wrong choice. Margaret felt blood drain from her face. She excused herself to the restroom, locked herself in a stall, and stood there shaking. For 3 years, she had told herself Daniel would come crawling back, that he would realize his mistake, that she had been teaching him a necessary lesson about the real world. But what if she was wrong? No, Margaret steadied herself. She couldn't be wrong. She had built an empire on good judgment. She knew what was best for her son. But the doubt, once planted, grew roots. Margaret began noticing things she had ignored before. How her phone rarely rang with personal calls. How her calendar was full of business meetings but empty of friendship. How her penthouse, despite its luxury, echoed with emptiness. She attended galas and gave speeches. She closed deals and made millions. But when she came home, there was no one to share it with. No family dinners, no grandchildren's laughter, no son calling to ask her advice. Margaret had won the battle. She had proven her point. She had maintained her standards. But sitting alone in her $15 million home, she began to wonder what exactly she had won. The fortress she had built around herself was impenetrable, which meant nothing could get out, including her.
The fall began on a Tuesday morning in September, 7 years after Margaret had disowned her son. Margaret was 65 years old. Beaumont Capital Management had grown to manage $8 billion in assets. Her personal wealth was estimated at $80 million. She sat on 4 corporate boards. She had achieved everything she set out to accomplish. Then her phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. "Mrs. Beaumont, this is Agent Thomas Carter from the FBI. We need to speak with you immediately about your business partner, Lawrence Richmond." Margaret's blood went cold. Lawrence Richmond had been her right hand for 12 years. He managed the firm's investment strategies. He brought in major clients. He made them all very wealthy. He was also, as Margaret learned that morning, running a massive Ponzi scheme through a subsidiary company. The FBI had been investigating for 8 months. They had evidence, documents, wire transfers, testimony from whistleblowers, and Margaret's name was all over the paperwork. "I had no knowledge of this," Margaret told the agents in her lawyer's office that afternoon. Agent Carter laid out photographs. "Your signature is on these authorization forms, Mrs. Beaumont. Lawrence forged those. I never saw those documents." "Then why did you receive quarterly bonuses directly from the subsidiary accounts?" Margaret felt the room spin. "I thought those were performance bonuses from legitimate investments." The investigation took 6 months. Margaret was never charged criminally. The FBI believed she had been negligent rather than complicit. But negligence was enough. The civil lawsuits came like an avalanche. 43 clients who had lost money, each one suing Margaret personally, each one claiming she had a fiduciary duty to know what her partner was doing. Margaret's lawyers were confident at first. "We can fight this. You have liability insurance. Your personal assets are protected." But they weren't. Lawrence had structured the scheme carefully. He had used Margaret's personal guarantees to secure loans. He had put her name on offshore accounts she never knew existed. He had made her legally liable for debts totaling $200 million. When the verdicts came, they were devastating. Margaret was ordered to pay $72 million in restitution and damages. Her insurance covered $20 million. The rest had to come from her personal assets. Everything went on the auction block. The penthouse sold for $14 million, less than she paid for it. Her art collection went for $8 million. Her jewelry, her cars, her vacation home in the Hamptons, all of it liquidated. It still wasn't enough. The court froze her remaining assets. Beaumont Capital Management was dissolved. Margaret's reputation, built over 30 years, evaporated in months. Business associates stopped returning calls. Board positions disappeared. Invitations to galas were quietly rescinded. Patricia Chambers, who had attended Margaret's birthday party, crossed the street to avoid her at Bergdorf Goodman. Margaret moved into a small apartment in a building that used to house her firm's junior analysts. One bedroom, 900 square feet, paper-thin walls where she could hear her neighbors arguing. She was 66 years old and starting over with almost nothing. Her lawyer, Rebecca Chin, sat across from her in a coffee shop instead of her former corner office. Margaret, you need to understand your situation. After all debts are paid, you'll have approximately $140,000 left. Your Social Security will give you about $2,800 monthly. You need to think about your future carefully. Margaret stared at her coffee. What future? Everything I built is gone. You're not bankrupt, you have options. You could consult, use your experience. Rebecca, Margaret's voice was hollow. No one will hire me. My name is poison in this industry. Then what will you do? For the first time in her adult life, Margaret Beaumont had no answer. The months that followed were a brutal education in humility. Margaret learned what it meant to check price tags before buying groceries. She learned to take the subway because taxis were too expensive. She learned that a good coat could last 3 winters if she took care of it. She learned what it felt like to be invisible. In her old life, people noticed Margaret Beaumont when she entered a room. Now, she was just another older woman on the subway, carrying shopping bags from discount stores. The loneliness was suffocating. Margaret had built her entire identity around success and status. Without those things, who was she? She thought about Daniel constantly now. Where was he? Was he still in Queens? Did he know about her fall? Did he care? Pride kept her from calling, the same pride that had cost her everything else. Margaret would lie awake at night, in her tiny apartment, listening to traffic sounds and neighbor arguments, and wonder how she had ended up here. She had been so certain, so sure she was right. But right about exactly what? What had she won by being right? The answer echoed in the empty room: nothing. She had won nothing at all.
It was 3 in the morning when Margaret finally admitted she needed help. She had been staring at the ceiling for hours. Rent was due in 5 days. She had $473 in her account. Her landlord had already extended her deadline twice. Margaret had spent 2 months applying for jobs. Every application was rejected. Her name was permanently associated with the Richmond scandal. She had sold everything of value: jewelry, designer clothes, her mother's pearls, all gone. All she had left was pride, and pride didn't pay rent. Margaret reached for her phone. She had Daniel's number memorized, never deleted, never called. For 10 years she told herself she would never make this call, that Daniel would come to her, that she would never beg. But desperation redefines what you thought you would never do. Her finger hovered over the screen. What would she say? How do you ask for help from someone you disowned? She dialed before she could change her mind. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Hello? Daniel's voice. After 10 years, it sounded older, tired. Daniel? Margaret's voice cracked. It's your mother. Silence. She could hear breathing. How did you get this number? It's still the same number. I never deleted it. What do you want? The tone was not angry. It was indifferent, like talking to a stranger. I know I have no right to call, but I'm in trouble, and I don't have anyone else. What kind of trouble? Margaret closed her eyes. Financial trouble. The business collapsed. I lost everything. I'm about to lose my apartment. I need a small loan, just enough to get back on my feet. You need money. Yes, and you're calling me for money. Daniel, please, I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. You wouldn't ask if you weren't desperate, Daniel repeated slowly. 10 years ago, I called you. I wanted to invite you to our wedding. Do you remember what you said? Margaret said nothing. You said you would never lower yourself to attend. You said if I went through with it, I was dead to you. I was angry. I said things. You said I would come crawling back when reality hit, when love stopped paying bills, when you realized money matters more than feelings. Margaret felt tears. I was wrong. Were you? Because you're only calling now because reality hit you, because your bills aren't getting paid, because suddenly money matters. That's not fair. Fair? You cut me out because you chose to love someone you considered beneath us. You froze my trust fund. You told everyone I was an embarrassment. 10 years, Mom. 10 years of silence. No birthday calls, no Christmas cards, nothing. I'm sorry. Are you sorry? Or are you broke? The question hit like a blow. Both, Margaret whispered. I'm both. She heard Daniel take a deep breath. I can't help you, Mom. Daniel, please. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. You wouldn't ask if you weren't desperate. 10 years ago, you made a choice. You told me there was no going back. You were right. There isn't. But I'm your mother. No. You stopped being my mother when you made me choose between you and Sophie. Mothers love unconditionally. You loved me with conditions. When I didn't meet them, you threw me away. Margaret was crying openly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I believe you are, but sorry doesn't undo 10 years. Sorry doesn't replace missed moments. Sorry doesn't heal wounds you kept open for a decade. So you're just going to let me become homeless? Silence stretched. No, Daniel said finally. I'm not that cruel, but I'm not going to save you either. What does that mean? It means call Sophie. What? Call my wife, the woman you said wasn't good enough for our family. Call her and ask for help. See what happens. The line went dead. Margaret sat in darkness, phone pressed to her ear, listening to empty tone. She had gambled everything on this call and lost. But Daniel had given her one option. The woman she had rejected, mocked, dismissed 10 years ago. Could she really call Sophie Martinez and ask for help? Could her pride withstand that final humiliation? Margaret looked around her tiny apartment, at the eviction notice, at her empty refrigerator, at her life crumbling into dust. She didn't have a choice. Tomorrow, she would have to call the woman she once told wasn't worthy of breathing the same air as her family. The irony was suffocating. Margaret Beaumont, who once had everything, would now beg for mercy from the girl she destroyed at a single glance. Pride, it turned out, was expensive, and Margaret could no longer afford it.
Margaret waited 3 days before calling Sophie. 3 days of staring at the phone. 3 days of rehearsing what to say. 3 days of pride wrestling with desperation. On the 3rd day, the eviction notice became final.
Mr. Chen knocked at 8 in the morning. Mrs. Beaumont, I'm sorry, but if I don't have rent by Friday, I must proceed with eviction. Margaret nodded. In her old life, she would have been the one evicting tenants. Business was business. After Mr. Chen left, Margaret pulled out the napkin with Sophie's number. Daniel had texted it the morning after their call. No message, just the number. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed. The phone rang 4 times. "Hello?" Sophie's voice, warm, slightly out of breath. "Is this Sophie Martinez?" "This is Sophie Beaumont now, actually. Who's calling?" Margaret's throat closed. Sophie had taken Daniel's name. "This is Margaret Beaumont, Daniel's mother." Silence. Surprised silence. "Mrs. Beaumont, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know. Daniel said I should contact you. I'm in a difficult situation. I heard about what happened with your company. I'm sorry." The genuine sympathy was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Daniel told me you need help." "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes. "I'm about to be evicted. I have nowhere to go. I wouldn't be calling if I had any other option." "I understand. I need to borrow money, just for rent. I'll pay you back as soon as I find work." Sophie was quiet. "Where are you living now?" "Murray Hill, a small apartment. The rent is $1,800 monthly." "And you can't afford that anymore?" "No." "What about savings, retirement accounts?" "Gone. Everything went to the lawsuits. I have about $400 left." Sophie exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Beaumont, I need to be honest. Daniel and I talked after he spoke with you. We talked for a long time." Margaret braced herself for rejection. "Daniel was very hurt by your call, not because you asked for money, but because it took losing everything to reach out. He said it proved you only valued him for what he could provide." Margaret felt tears coming. He was right. "But I told Daniel something he needed to hear." Sophie's voice was firm but kind. "I told him, hurt people hurt people. That you were clearly hurting 10 years ago." "I don't understand." "Mrs. Beaumont, people who are drowning will push away those trying to save them. It's not malice, it's panic." Margaret said nothing. "I think you were drowning 10 years ago. You lost your husband. You were building an empire while raising a son alone. You were terrified of losing control. When Daniel chose love over security, it felt like he was choosing to drown too. That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Sophie agreed. "It doesn't. But it helps explain it. And I believe in second chances. I believe people can change when they're ready to face their mistakes." "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix everything today. Here's what's going to happen. Daniel and I decided something. We're not going to loan you money for your apartment." Margaret's heart sunk. "We're going to invite you to stay with us here in Queens. We have a guest room. It's small, but clean and warm. You can stay as long as you need." Margaret couldn't speak. The offer was so unexpected, so completely beyond what she deserved. "Mrs. Beaumont, are you still there?" "Why would you do this?" Margaret whispered. "After everything I said, after how I treated you." Sophie was quiet. "Because 10 years ago, I was a waitress going to nursing school. I was broke, exhausted, and terrified. You know what kept me going? Knowing that kindness matters more than money, that character matters more than status. You tried to teach Daniel that money was everything, but he showed me that love and integrity are worth more than any fortune. And now we're going to show you the same thing. I don't deserve this. No, Sophie said gently. You don't. But that's what grace is, getting what you don't deserve. Can you be here Saturday morning? I'll text you our address. Yes. Margaret was crying now. Yes, I can be there. Good. Bring whatever fits in a suitcase. We'll figure out the rest together. Sophie? Yes? Thank you. You're welcome, Mrs. Beaumont. See you Saturday. The line went dead. Margaret sat holding the phone, tears streaming down her face. The woman she had dismissed as unworthy was now offering shelter. The girl she said would never be family was treating her like family. For the first time in 10 years, Margaret Beaumont felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope.
Saturday morning arrived cold and gray. Margaret stood outside the address Sophie had texted, holding a single suitcase containing everything she had left. The building was a 3-story walk-up in Astoria, Queens. The brick facade needed repainting. The front steps had cracks. A small grocery store occupied the ground floor, its neon sign flickering. This was where her son lived. This was where Daniel had built a life without her. Margaret climbed to the second floor, apartment 2B. She stood outside for a full minute before knocking. Sophie opened the door almost immediately. Mrs. Beaumont, welcome. Sophie looked older than Margaret remembered, not in a bad way. She looked like someone who had lived through challenges and emerged stronger. Hair pulled back in a ponytail, jeans and a sweater. No makeup, no jewelry, except a simple wedding band. She looked happy. Thank you for having me. Come in. Let me take your suitcase. The apartment was small, maybe 800 square feet. The living room flowed into the kitchen with no wall between. Furniture was mismatched but clean. Bookshelves lined one wall. Photographs covered every surface. Margaret's eyes were drawn to them immediately. Daniel and Sophie on their wedding day outside City Hall. Daniel at a community center surrounded by teenagers. Sophie in scrubs holding a certificate. The two of them hiking with mountains behind them. 10 years of life. 10 years of moments Margaret had missed by choice. Daniel's at the hospital, Sophie said. He works Saturday mornings at a free clinic. He should be home around 1. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Let me show you the guest room. Sophie led her down a short hallway. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. The guest room was tiny, 10 by 10 feet, a twin bed, a small dresser, a window overlooking the street. It's not much, Sophie said, but it's yours for as long as you need. It's perfect. Margaret meant it. After wondering if she would sleep on the street, this small room felt like luxury. The bathroom is across the hall. We share it. Fresh towels are on your bed. Take your time settling in. I'll make coffee. Sophie left, closing the door gently. Margaret sat on the bed. The room was spotlessly clean. Fresh flowers sat in a jar on the dresser. Daisies, simple and cheerful. When was the last time someone had put flowers in a room for her? Margaret opened her suitcase. Everything she owned fit inside. 3 changes of clothes, toiletries, a photograph of Daniel as a child, her mother's wedding ring. She heard sounds from the kitchen, running water, the clink of mugs, and humming. Sophie was humming while she made coffee.
Margaret walked to the door and opened it slightly. Through the crack, she could see the kitchen. Sophie stood at the counter preparing a French press, humming a melody. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching in Sophie's hair. She looked content. Not rich, not powerful, just content. Margaret had spent her life chasing success, building empires, accumulating wealth, climbing social ladders, and she had been miserable. This woman, who Margaret had dismissed as unworthy, had found something Margaret never had: peace. "Margaret?" Sophie called. "How do you take your coffee?" "Black is fine." Margaret sat back on the bed. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from recognition. She had been so wrong about everything, about what mattered, about what made a life worth living. Sophie had nothing Margaret valued 10 years ago. No money, no status, no connections. But Sophie had everything Margaret had lost: kindness, integrity, the ability to forgive, the capacity to love without conditions. A gentle knock on the door. "Mrs. Beaumont, coffee's ready." "Thank you. I'll be right there." Margaret stood and looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. She barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she looked older, but because for the first time in decades, she was looking at herself honestly. She was 66, broke, homeless, living in a tiny guest room in Queens, dependent on the charity of a woman she once called unsuitable. And somehow, standing in that small room with second-hand furniture and cheerful daisies, Margaret felt something she thought she had lost forever: the possibility of becoming a better person. She opened the door and walked into the kitchen where Sophie waited with 2 mugs of coffee and homemade cookies. "Please sit," Sophie gestured to the small kitchen table. Margaret Beaumont, who once commanded boardrooms and intimidated billionaires, sat down at a second-hand kitchen table and accepted a cookie from the woman whose life she tried to destroy, the woman who was saving her anyway.
They sat at the kitchen table in silence for several minutes. Margaret held her coffee mug with both hands. Sophie ate a cookie and waited. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Accept help? Be here? Be the person who needs instead of the person who provides?" Sophie nodded. "That must be difficult for someone like you." "Someone like me," Margaret repeated. "You mean someone who spent their whole life controlling everything?" "I mean someone who built their identity around being self-sufficient. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Self-sufficiency is a survival skill. Control is a defense mechanism. One keeps you alive. The other keeps you alone." Margaret looked up sharply. "You sound like a therapist." "I'm a nurse. We learn about human behavior, especially behavior driven by fear." "You think I was afraid?" "I think you were terrified. Your husband died when Daniel was 12. You had to build a business while raising a son alone. You had to be strong when you probably wanted to fall apart. And somewhere along the way, being strong became being hard." Margaret felt tears threatening. "You're being very kind to someone who didn't deserve it." "Maybe, but everyone has a story. Everyone is fighting battles no one sees. You were cruel to me 10 years ago, but I don't think you were cruel because you're a cruel person. I think you were protecting something you thought was in danger." "What was I protecting?" "Your son's future, your family's legacy, your own sense of worth." Sophie paused. "Can I ask you something personal?" Margaret nodded. "When your husband died, did anyone ask if you were okay, or did everyone just expect you to keep going?" Margaret's hands trembled. She set down her mug. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I was back in the office. The board expected it. Our clients expected it. If I showed weakness, they would have taken the company. So I didn't show weakness. You didn't show anything. No, I didn't. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how. Sophie reached across the table, but didn't touch Margaret's hand. The gesture was there if Margaret wanted it. You're being human right now. It's a start. Margaret looked at Sophie's hand, so close but not imposing. 10 years ago, she wouldn't have imagined this conversation. Why did you really say yes? Margaret asked. When I called for help, why did you say yes? Sophie withdrew her hand and wrapped it around her mug. Honestly, part of me didn't want to. Part of me wanted to tell you that karma is real and maybe you needed to learn what rejection felt like. Margaret flinched but nodded. I would have deserved that. Yes, you would have. But Daniel taught me something important. That hurting people who hurt you doesn't heal you. It just creates more hurt. So you did this for Daniel? No, I did it for me. Because I want to be the kind of person who chooses compassion even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. They sat in silence again. But this silence was different, less awkward, more contemplative. Can I tell you something? Margaret said quietly. Of course. When Daniel told me he was marrying you, I hired an investigator. Sophie's expression didn't change. I assumed you did. He told me you were putting yourself through nursing school, that you sent money home to your parents every month even though you barely had enough, that you volunteered at a homeless shelter on weekends. And that made you want to stop the wedding even more. Yes. Margaret's voice broke. It meant you were real. It meant Daniel loved you for real reasons. It meant I couldn't convince him you were after his money. So instead of accepting I was wrong, I doubled down. I told myself and everyone else that you were manipulating him. And now? Now I'm sitting in your home, eating your cookies, accepting your charity. And I know exactly how good you are, which makes what I did so much worse. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Beaumont, I'm not going to tell you it's okay. What you did wasn't okay. You hurt Daniel deeply. You hurt me. You tried to destroy our marriage before it even began. I know. But I also know that people can change. I've seen it happen. I've watched patients who were angry and bitter transform when they finally let people help them. I believe you can do the same. What if I can't? What if I'm too old, too set in my ways? Then you'll stay miserable. Sophie's voice was matter of fact. But I don't think that's what you want anymore. I think you're tired of being alone. I think you're ready to try something different. I don't know how. That's why you're here. Sophie smiled for the first time since Margaret arrived. To learn.
At 12:45, Margaret heard keys in the door. Her body went rigid. Sophie glanced at her from the kitchen. It's okay. Just breathe. The door opened. Daniel stepped inside, wearing his white coat. He was 38 now. Gray had started at his temples. He looked tired, but contented. He looked like his father. Daniel saw Sophie first and smiled. Then he saw Margaret at the table. The smile disappeared. Mom. The word was flat. Not angry, not warm, just fact. Hello, Daniel. 10 years of silence compressed into 10 seconds. I'm going to change. We'll talk after lunch. He walked past without another word and disappeared into the bedroom. The door closed. Not a slam, just a firm click that felt worse. Sophie brought soup to the table. Give him time. This is hard for him, too. He hates me. No, he's hurt. There's a difference. 20 minutes later, Daniel emerged in jeans and a sweater.
He sat as far from Margaret as the small space allowed. Sophie served soup. They ate in silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. "How long are you planning to stay?" "I don't know. As long as Sophie will let me." "And what are you going to do?" "I don't know that either." Daniel looked up. His eyes were his father's eyes. "You don't know anything, do you?" His voice was quiet but sharp. "You always had all the answers. You always knew exactly what everyone should do. And now you're sitting at my table telling me you don't know." "Daniel," Sophie said gently. "No, Sophie. This needs to be said." He looked at Margaret. "For 10 years, I wondered if you ever thought about me, if you ever regretted what you did." "I did." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Every day. But you never called." "No." "Why not?" "Pride and fear. I was afraid you would reject me, so I told myself it was better not to try. But that was a lie. I was a coward." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You destroyed my trust fund, cut me out of the company, told everyone I was making the biggest mistake of my life." "Yes." "You made my wedding day about your hurt feelings." "Yes." "You missed everything. My graduation, my promotions, my life." "Yes." Daniel's hands shook. "Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the money. I never cared about money. It was knowing your love had conditions, that I was only worth loving if I lived the life you wanted." A tear ran down Margaret's face. "You're right, and I'm sorry. Those words don't fix anything, but they're true. You deserved a mother who loved unconditionally. Instead, you got me." The kitchen was silent except for the clock ticking. "Why should I believe you've changed? You're only here because you lost everything. If you were still rich, would you be sitting here? Would you have called? Or would I still be dead to you?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. "I don't know," she said finally. "I want to say yes, but I can't be sure. Maybe I needed to lose everything to see what really mattered. Maybe I needed to be broken to understand what I broke. That's not good enough. I know. So what now? You live here? We pretend 10 years didn't happen? No. Everything is not fine. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve the chance to try. But Sophie offered me a place, and I accepted because I have nowhere else. If my being here hurts you too much, I'll leave." "Where? You have nothing." "Then I'll figure it out. I've already taken too much from you. I won't take your peace, too." Daniel looked at Sophie. His wife's face was calm. "What do you think?" Sophie took his hand. "I think your mother is telling the truth. I think she's broken and scared and doesn't know how to fix what she destroyed. And I think everyone deserves a chance to try, even when it's hard, even when they don't deserve it. That's what grace means." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "You can stay," he said finally. "But I can't promise this will be easy. I can't promise I'll forgive you. And I can't promise we'll ever be what we were." Margaret nodded, tears streaming freely now. "I understand. Thank you, Daniel." "Don't thank me. Thank Sophie. She's the one who believes in second chances." Daniel stood and walked to the window, his back to both women. Sophie squeezed Margaret's hand gently. It was a start, a fragile, painful start, but it was more than Margaret had any right to hope for. And sometimes, a start is all you need.
The first week was the hardest. Margaret woke every morning at 5:30, a habit from her old life. She would lie in the small guest room, listening to the building come alive. Neighbors arguing through thin walls. Traffic below. A baby crying somewhere above. She had lived in silence and luxury so long that this symphony of ordinary life felt overwhelming. But she got up, made her bed, waited until she heard Sophie in the kitchen before emerging. "Can I help with breakfast?" Margaret asked that first Monday. Sophie looked surprised. "Sure, you can set the table." Margaret set 3 plates, 3 forks, 3 mugs. Simple tasks that felt monumental. Daniel came out dressed for work. He nodded at Margaret, but didn't speak. He ate quickly, kissed Sophie goodbye, and left. "He needs time," Sophie said. "I know." The days developed a rhythm. Sophie worked 3 12-hour shifts per week at the hospital. On those days, Margaret was alone. At first, she didn't know what to do with herself. So she walked, miles through Queens. She discovered neighborhoods she never knew existed. She watched how people really lived. Messy, loud, beautiful. She watched mothers pushing strollers, elderly men playing chess in the park, teenagers laughing outside bodegas. One afternoon, she passed a community center. A sign read, "Volunteers needed." Margaret stood outside for 10 minutes before walking in. By the second week, Margaret was volunteering 3 mornings per week. She helped organize donated clothes. She served coffee at a senior center. She listened to elderly immigrants tell stories. She was terrible at it at first. She tried to organize things her way, efficiently, like running a business. The coordinator, Maria, pulled her aside. "Margaret, this isn't a corporation. You can't manage people here. You have to be with people. There's a difference." "I don't understand." Maria smiled. "Stop trying to fix everything. Stop trying to be in charge. Just show up and be present. That's all we need." It was the hardest thing Margaret had ever done. Harder than building a company. Being present. Being humble. Being just one person among many. But slowly, she learned. At home, small changes accumulated. Margaret started cooking dinner on nights when Sophie worked late. Simple meals. Pasta, roasted chicken, nothing fancy, but made with care. The first time Daniel came home to find his mother had cooked, he stopped in the doorway. "You cooked? I hope that's okay. I used to cook when you were little." Daniel sat down, took a bite, chewed slowly. "It's good. Tastes like I remember." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. 3 weeks in, Margaret found a part-time job at a bookstore, minimum wage, organizing shelves, helping customers find titles. It was humbling work for someone who once managed $8 billion. But there was something peaceful about it. No high-stakes decisions, no board meetings, just books and people who loved them. One evening, Margaret came home to find Daniel and Sophie in the living room. Daniel was reading case files. Sophie was knitting. "How was work?" Sophie asked. "Good. A woman came in looking for a book for her grandson's birthday. We talked for 30 minutes about what 10-year-old boys like to read." Daniel looked up. "Did you find something?" "Yes, a mystery series. She was so happy." "That's nice," Daniel said, then returned to his reading. But Margaret noticed. He had asked. He had engaged. It was small, but it was progress. By the 4th week, Margaret had her first real conversation with Daniel. They were both in the kitchen late at night. Sophie was asleep. Daniel was making tea. Margaret couldn't sleep. "Can't sleep either?" Daniel asked. "No, too much on my mind." Daniel poured 2 cups and sat across from her. "What's on your mind?" Margaret considered lying, but she decided on truth. "I'm trying to figure out who I am without money and status. Turns out I built my entire identity on things that can be taken away. Now I'm 66 and starting over. It's terrifying." Daniel sipped his tea. "You know what I learned doing social work? People are more than their circumstances. You're not what you owned or what you earned. You're what you do when everything is stripped away. And what am I doing? You're trying. You're showing up. You're learning to be human again. Is it working?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "Ask me in 6 months." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Margaret went to bed that night feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly. Not peace, but something close. Hope. Small and fragile, but real. She was learning that transformation doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in quiet moments, in choosing humility over pride, in showing up every day, even when it's hard. She was learning that being broken isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning. And as Margaret lay in her small guest room listening to the sounds of Queens at night, she realized something profound. For the first time in decades, she wasn't alone in her fortress anymore. She was home.
5 years passed. Not 5 years of perfection, but 5 years of showing up. 5 years of small choices that accumulated into transformation. Margaret was 71 now. She still lived in the guest room in Queens. The bookstore had promoted her to manager. She made $38,000 a year, a fraction of what she once earned, but it was honest money, and it was enough. The community center had given her an award for volunteer service, 500 hours over 5 years. But the real transformation wasn't visible in awards. It was visible in small moments, in how Margaret now asked questions instead of giving orders, in how she listened instead of lecturing, in her ability to apologize when wrong. It was visible in her relationship with Daniel. They would never get back the 10 years they lost. Some wounds leave scars, but they had built something new, something earned rather than assumed. They had dinner together every Sunday. Sometimes they talked about deep things, often just ordinary life, work, books, weather. And that ordinariness was its own kind of miracle. It was a Sunday evening in October when everything changed again. Margaret was setting the table. Sophie had barely touched her wine. "Are you feeling okay?" Margaret asked. Sophie and Daniel exchanged a look. "Mom," Daniel said, "we have something to tell you." Margaret's heart clenched. After 5 years of progress, she still feared losing it all. "Sophie's pregnant," Daniel smiled. "You're going to be a grandmother." Time stopped. Margaret's hands went to her mouth. Tears spilled. "When?" Margaret whispered. "April," Sophie said. "We're 12 weeks along." "A baby! Her grandchild!" "We've been talking," Daniel continued, "about what role you'd want to have, if you want to be involved." "If I want to be involved?" "We need to know you'll respect our parenting choices, that you won't try to take over." This was the final test, the moment where she proved she had truly changed. "I would love to be involved,"
Margaret said carefully, "in whatever capacity you're comfortable with. I promise I'll respect your choices, and if I start to slip into old patterns, please call me on it." Daniel nodded. "Okay, then we want you to be part of this." Margaret started crying. Sophie hugged her. Daniel joined them. For the first time in 15 years, Margaret was being included. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because she had earned it. The baby arrived in April. A girl. They named her Grace. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Grace. Unearned favor. Getting what you don't deserve. The first time Margaret held her granddaughter, she understood something profound. This tiny human represented everything she had almost lost through pride. But she also represented everything that could be redeemed through humility and love. Margaret was there for middle-of-the-night feedings. She was there for first smiles. She was there, but never overbearing. Helpful, but never controlling. She had finally learned the difference. One evening, when Grace was 6 months old, Margaret was rocking her to sleep. Daniel stood in the doorway. "You're good with her," Daniel said quietly. "I'm trying to be the grandmother I should have been." Daniel came into the room and sat beside her. "Mom, I need to tell you something." Margaret's heart tightened. "I forgive you." 3 words, simple words, but they carried the weight of 15 years. "You do?" "I do. It took me a long time, but watching you with Grace, seeing how hard you've worked to change, I can't hold on to anger anymore. You've done the work. You've changed, and I forgive you." Margaret couldn't speak. She just held her granddaughter and cried while her son put his arm around her shoulders. The fortress she had built all those years ago was gone. The walls had crumbled, and in its place was something immeasurably better. A family, messy, imperfect, but real. Margaret Beaumont had lost everything. Her money, her status, her pride. But in losing everything, she had gained what actually mattered. Love, connection, purpose, grace. Not the baby Grace, though she was precious beyond measure, but grace itself, the kind that forgives, the kind that redeems, the kind that says you're never too old, never too broken, never too far gone to change. If this story touched your heart, think about someone in your life. Maybe someone you've hurt. Maybe someone who hurt you. Maybe someone you've been too proud to call. Life is short. Pride is expensive. And sometimes the people we push away are the ones we need most. Margaret waited 10 years. Don't wait that long. Make the call. Send the message. Take the first step. Because the best time to rebuild a broken relationship was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's never too late to choose grace.